Good morning and welcome to the webinar. We're going to be talking about not all pen tests are created equal, choosing the right vulnerability management program for your organization. So to get us kicked off, I'm Eric Vanderburg, Vice President of Cybersecurity at TCDI. I have with me Bogdan Salamakha. He's our Senior Cybersecurity Engineer, and Chris Kolezynksi. He's our Cybersecurity Engineer. And the three of us will talk to you about vulnerability management program in general, and then a lot of what really comprises the different pen test, vulnerability scans, a lot of different terms that are out there. And that's really key to this because this is an industry where different companies will use the same term to describe vastly different services, and it can make it challenging to choose the right company. The first part of having an organized strategy for addressing the vulnerabilities in your organization is really to put together a program. Obviously, there are threats to our companies, to our systems, and those threats are generated in a variety of different ways, but they are either vulnerabilities that are identified in software, and then a company will produce a patch to go and fix that software. So it could be you're not applying a patch or updates to systems, or it could be a configuration issue that you have in your software. Maybe you left a default, or you've enabled a service that's no longer needed, or just the interplay of different technologies together. Obviously, this is with the constantly adding new software, new integrations, cloud services, and so many other things. The technology is quite a complex beast today, and so there can be a lot of interplay between those different components that can produce some vulnerabilities or ways for attackers to exploit your system. So starting off with a vulnerability management program, this is you establishing the structure. How are you going to manage your vulnerabilities? How are you going to identify them? And how are we going to remediate it? So you get back to a comfortable level of risk. And it may sound a little odd saying comfortable level of risk, but there's always going to be some level of risk that your organization faces. And I'm particularly talking about cybersecurity risk here. Just like other risks that your organization faces, you have risk of liability, or risk of physical damage to your facility, or risk of employee theft. There's so many different risks out there. Here, cybersecurity risk is going to be one of those. Say there's some level that you're comfortable with. There could be a level that you're required to maintain at and under certain regulations. If let's say you're under HIPAA in healthcare, or if you're doing business in the EU under GDPR, or for California and CCPA. So that may specify a level of risk as well. The first step is to assign some roles and responsibilities, identify who's going to be in charge of this program, who's going to be responsible for performing the different tasks. Establish a goal and identify how are we going to measure success in this program. And then identify how often are you going to do both your vulnerability scans and your penetration tests, and also from which perspective. So just saying vulnerability scan or pen test, that doesn't state where you're doing the scanning. Are we going to scan all of our internal machines? When I say machine, does that include the workstations and servers? What about IoT, things like your internet connected cameras, or or TVs, or devices that are interfacing with HVAC, or a variety of whatever mechanical components that you have around in your business, or if you're a factory. So all those would need to be considered. Printers and such. Sometimes that's a forgotten item, but we found that there can be quite a few vulnerabilities on printers, these network-enabled devices that can allow an attacker to exploit them and utilize them. So identifying the scope, does this include wireless testing, and internal, is this just external? and then how often you're going to do that. Some companies might have a rotating schedule where they're going to do certain parts of the company or certain just workstations here and then servers at this time. But you're also going to want to touch on all the systems at a regular point. This is because the longer a vulnerability exists, the more detrimental it can be, because those the tools and the exploits that are available for it are going to be easier for attackers to acquire as they are disseminated through the underground environment there. So you want to be able to resolve those as quickly as possible. You're going to establish what your acceptable risk level is, and as part of this, you want to then establish how long is it going to take for us to remediate the vulnerabilities that we identify. So if we identify a critical vulnerability, how long are we going to give the team to resolve that? And this is going to be aligned with your acceptable risk level. So again, I'll give you just some examples. You may say a critical, I got to resolve that within some companies it may be 24 hours, maybe you're saying it's within 3 days. And if I find a high, maybe that's within a week or 2 weeks or a month. Mediums, maybe that's a month. So you're going to establish what that time frame is, and then you're going to hold those accountable, whoever's assigned these roles and responsibilities, for remediating those within that time frame. So as we break down the vulnerability management program, first you want to discover. We have to identify those vulnerabilities, and in order to do that, you need to, of course, have a clear picture of what assets do you have in your organization. So this would be, as I mentioned before, the computers, the servers, IoT, printers, wireless devices, all those things. So, what's the scope of it? And don't forget about other services you may utilize. If you have web services that are hosted out in the cloud, or if you're utilizing other cloud resources or hosted resources, you're going to want to make sure that those are included in this as well. And then once you do your vulnerability scans or pen tests, you're going to need to report on that. Make sure that those who are responsible for remediating, they understand what the issues are, and then prioritize them. And this should go right back to your remediation plan, and then respond. Go ahead and implement those fixes, test them. This could involve doing a validation scan to ensure that those vulnerabilities no longer exist, or if it was something that required a pen test, then doing a retest on that to ensure that those vulnerabilities no longer exist. And far too many times we've seen where a company is, they've applied the patch or the fix, or at least they think they did, but they missed something. And then later on that vulnerability is exploited, and it's something that they easily could have addressed had they known that they had missed that. So it does require an extra level of diligence here to ensure that you're adequately defending against the risks. So as you start looking at these different tasks, some of these things are things you might do in-house, but oftentimes these are outsourced activities. And so when you do that, you have to engage with somebody you trust. You're giving them access to systems. There's usually, at least when we do this, there's an authorization where you're saying, hey, I give you permission to go and try to break into my systems, and then tell me what's wrong. And so you are trusting that provider to provide that service to you and to do a good job of it, and not to take your systems down or abuse that trust. So let's talk about this a little bit.
Yeah, and with engaging a trusted third party, there's a lot of considerations you want to take. Everything from who it is to the tools they use, and we're just kind of going to run through some of these items and have a little back and forth as to why they're important and why you want to make these considerations. That way, you are essentially getting the best bang for your buck, and you're getting the most value out of the actual pen test in your vulnerability management program. There's obviously a very large amount of tools for a variety of tasks in the pen testing world. Everything from open source tools to commercial and proprietary tools, tools that can be developed in-house for very specific types of testing. When you're choosing a vendor and you're evaluating maybe a few different vendors, there's certain questions you want to ask, and these may not be the exact questions you'll ask every vendor, but depending on your program and depending the goal for your vulnerability management program, you may want to ask things like, are you using a combination of open source and commercial and proprietary tools, or are you strictly open source? And open source tools can contain everything from, your like publicly available vulnerability scanners to open source scripts that were developed by other security personnel in the industry that perform a very specific task. And some of you may be very, very familiar with tools that are included within the Kali suite. And there's definitely a lot of considerations, and I wanted to bring Chris on this. And Chris, can you explain why it's important to have a combination of, say, maybe a commercial vulnerability scanner and then the use of open source scripts and tools that are available like within a Kali penetration testing suite?
Yeah, sure. So when you're relying on just a single tool, you're going to miss vulnerabilities. By combining many tools, including maybe some of your own, you're going to give your client a more thorough pen test and cover more area. I've done pen tests before where a single tool will miss a vulnerability that another tool will catch. And our process typically would be to combine results from multiple tools, all open source, commercial, and proprietary, so that we're giving our client the most thorough test possible.
Right. And tools are very important because tools is essentially your ability to perform certain tasks in the same way that a mechanic may use very specialized tools to perform a certain task on an engine. It's the same with vulnerability management and penetration testing. There's some tools that may be better at performing certain tasks. However, there's a lot of considerations there. And I think one of the big factors here that we really want to focus on is the fact that automated vulnerability scans and automated pen tests are not necessarily equal to a pen test that is performed by a human, that is putting human logic into it and really evaluating the vulnerabilities. There's a lot of automated penetration testing suites out there. And even those, they're convenient. Some of them are fairly pricey. However, they do not, in most cases, they do not evaluate the vulnerabilities as a whole. Instead, they evaluate vulnerabilities as individual vulnerabilities, and they exploit each vulnerability on an individual basis, as opposed to seeing the bigger picture in a more holistic view. Outside of tools, and we can go next slide, the next very important thing is experience. With experience, you introduce a lot more layers to your pen test because, for one, we're making the very clear indication here that with experience, you're introducing the human element to your pen test. That means you're introducing someone that has experience with pen testing, that has the logical mind of looking at an environment, and his first thought is, or her first thought is, how can I break it? Obviously with the right permission, and the right vendor, when choosing the right vendor based on experience, typically you want to look for things like, okay, what kind of methodology are you using? Are you using custom attack plans, or using automatically generated attack plans? How are you performing research and combining vulnerabilities for a more thorough investigation of the environment, whether it's internal, external, web application pen tests? And how is the data analyzed and interpreted to provide value for you, during the process of the pen test, and even at the end of the pen test when you're going through the review of the report. we had a question come in, and we can cover it now since we're kind of on the subject still. The question was, is there a concern of conflicts if using more than one tool? There is a concern of conflicts, but I think the conflict there is mainly just you may be introducing more false positives, and we will touch on the topic of false positives a little bit further. But I think in general, you don't necessarily want to go out and use 25 tools to scan one environment, but typically we recommend maybe 3 to 5. That way you have a better picture, because certain tools may look at certain environments in a different way, and then you can take that information and and then put it through a false positive filter that's typically engaging the vendor and their experience in the industry, and really just knocking out the easy things before you actually go through with the remediation and everything. And and with experience, I guess jumping back to experience, Chris, can you maybe highlight why it's important and you maybe even have some examples why it's important for a vendor to have the experience of being able to create custom attack plans as opposed to using something automated? I know you had recently a experience where you were able to circumvent the authentication of a router that was not originally identified by vulnerability scanners.
Right. So, vulnerability scanners are great, but one thing they're not going to give you insight on is vulnerability chain. And things like, we did have one experience where we occasionally cover essentially 0-day vulnerability. And that's where curiosity plays the key. In one case, we were dealing with a router. We submitted credentials for the access, got an interesting response back, submitted credentials again, got a more interesting response back. So I followed up and submitted again, and all of a sudden I had root access to the router. And that was a vulnerability that wasn't published or known anywhere, but it was discovered based solely on, human curiosity. So having a pen tester that's not only curious, but has experience and knows to dig deeper and when to dig deeper is key.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's crucial, because that's one of those vulnerabilities where if Chris, if you didn't find it, there could have been someone with more malicious intent could have found it and then used that as a means of compromising his client to an extent. So
correct. Yeah. And this was a router that's used widely too, so it creates even a bigger issue then. This isn't something that just could be abused on one single router, but on many, obviously. So.
Right. And with experience, you should also take into consideration the importance of trusting a vendor, because you're essentially going to be giving this vendor, this pen tester, access to your environment. So, there should be a method that you're using to vet your vendors to make sure that they're respectable, that they maybe have a reputation, that they've been around for some time, or someone that personally knows them, or referral or something of that nature. Because the amount of times that we'll go out on site, and maybe Chris can speak to this, or where we're performing an internal pen test, after exploit, all of a sudden you have visibility of HIPAA information. Chris, can you talk about that a little bit? Something you've seen in the past?
Sure. So we did do an internal pen test for a healthcare organization, and we were able to obtain unauthenticated X11 access to a mammogram machine, and the mammogram machine had listed not only the X-rays but patient names and things of that nature. At that point, due to the concerns presented by HIPAA, we contacted the client immediately, and that goes back to trust. So if we see something like that, we're going to let them know as soon as possible so they can get it addressed quickly. And that's just, one great example of communication and trusting your pen testers, that they will contact you and let you know, hey, this is pretty serious. You're potentially leaking patient data. I get this addressed now.
Yeah, absolutely. And while we're on the topic, still on the topic of experience, methodology is very important. Here at TCDI, we lean on the side of using known trusted methodologies established by known organizations like NIST and CIS and other organizations like that. And we essentially tweak those methodologies to fit each and every situation individually, because no pen test is created equal. And something that we had in the past, when it comes to methodology, and it was a bit of a flaw where we saw when we engaged a new client, that client told us that their previous vendor deployed agents on every single server and workstation within their environment. And this was a fairly large organization. And their pen test was essentially them performing all of their attacks through these agents that were installed on servers and workstations within their environment using domain credentials. So with something like that, it's one of those things where like, okay, our agent already has, access to system hooks and system access on the machine because we have an agent there. So it's hard to then justify how valuable that is to be a true pen test as opposed to maybe a configuration audit or more of a very detailed credential vulnerability scan. So definitely a lot of considerations there. And then moving on to the next slide, next really important topic is communication. Communication is critical. Something that we've seen is it provides a lot of value when there are certain vulnerabilities that are discovered that are highs or criticals or even mediums, or if there is a collection of vulnerabilities that can be used in a holistic fashion to perform a greater attack. When a vendor takes that information and provides it to the client immediately, as opposed to throwing the kitchen sink at everything, gaining access that would have been very easy because of those vulnerabilities, and then telling the client about it basically at the end of the engagement. Whereas if you do it in the beginning of the beginning of the engagement, or when you first discover those vulnerabilities, it provides a lot of value because it's like, hey, there's an actual concern that these vulnerabilities pose a very, very serious risk to your environment. And a good example of this is in the past, the amount of times where we'll be engaged to perform an internal pen test and then discover vulnerabilities like Eternal Blue, vulnerabilities that just can completely cause complete havoc on an internal network if malware were to appear in there, because malware typically takes advantage of a vulnerability like that to the nth degree and causes a lot of damage. So you want to make sure that you're choosing a vendor that is willing to communicate throughout the engagement, communicate their methodologies. We've had engagements where we perform almost, I believe it was daily, every few hours, communication with the end client, because the end client had a very large network, and we essentially segmented portions of their network that were being tested, and it was communication back and forth of like, hey, we're starting testing now, and we will let you know as soon as we're done. And then through the process, it's constant back and forth of, hey, was this you? No, it wasn't. Yes, it was. Don't worry about it. That type of stuff. It has a lot of value. Another thing you want to do is you want to make sure that you are available for questions during the engagement, and obviously assist with questions after the engagement. You definitely don't want to be put in a position where at the end of the engagement, you're just given a report or an email of the findings, and then a wave by from a distance, and then you're kind of just stuck there with, hey, I have something, but now the person that was really digging into my environment is not there to provide that context and that assistance, with that written documentation, assuming there is documentation. We can go next slide. Reporting is definitely important. Let's just put it that way. You definitely want to be able to keep track of the vulnerabilities that were discovered, the exploits that were executed, and the results of that pen test in and of itself. So when you're choosing a vendor and you're making considerations, you want to make sure that the vendor is not just going to give you a printout of the vulnerability scan. whether it's in a spreadsheet format or in a document format. We have seen that where we'll engage a client and the client's like, well, this is what we got in the past. And it's literally a binder, a half-inch binder of 100 pages of just printout, just technical jargon, which may be valuable to the technical side, but for the C-suite, executives, it may not provide a lot of metrics, a lot of value in terms of how are we actually doing with the risk. So with selecting your vendor for reporting, you want to, we sometimes recommend asking for a sample report that'll give you a lot of insight as to how is this vendor evaluating the data, presenting the data, and how that may provide you with the value to be able to then take that data and hit the ground running in your remediation efforts. How are the vulnerabilities prioritized? Do they give you a set of recommendations outside of the vulnerability data, or is it just the vulnerability data, as well as simple things like, how are the results delivered, PDF formats, spreadsheets, or is it a combination of both? Will the report be in readable format? Is it auto-generated? I think another key point here is the vendor providing you with metrics. I know metrics are like gold nowadays when it comes to organizations, when it comes to evaluating vulnerabilities and risk and everything. So when you are given a report, you want to ask questions, or when you're choosing a vendor, you want to ask the questions of, hey, do you have a method of providing us with metrics? That way, if we were to engage you again, say 6 months down the line after we've done a remediation, will you be able to give us some metrics as to how our risk has changed, whether it's gone up or down, or has it stayed level? Because that type of information will provide a lot of insight to the stakeholders and to the people that are securing the environment as to where they're at, as opposed to kind of just, hey, everything is broken and bad, have fun. So the goals of a successful pen test, I think a lot of the goals are respective to each organization, but there are some clear-cut goals that you can extrapolate just based on what most organizations need from a pen test, a true pen test, that is. And that is, you definitely want to have a confidentiality agreement or a non-disclosure agreement to protect your data and protect your systems from unauthorized disclosure to other parties outside of the pen testing engagement. You definitely want to maintain good communication throughout the engagement. I think a very important point is very clear expectations from both parties as to what's expected from the pen testing side, and then what's expected from maybe the IT side from the client. So, but when you're engaging a vendor, you want to make sure that they tell you, okay, we are going to be performing these types of tests. We are going to be performing tests to the point of exploitation, but we're going to be, excluding denial of service and memory corruption and buffer corruption, things like that may cause permanent damage. Just some examples. And then you want to be able to have the vendor provide you with an explanation of the report after the fact. So that way you have not only the report written, but you can talk to the actual person that maybe performed the pen test, and that way you can get their context and their explanation as to, okay, why did I approach it this way, and why was it exploitable this way? And that's very important. I know, Chris, maybe you have some extra points on what would be the goal of a successful pen test.
Yeah, no, so, demonstrating impact is critical. And someone had a great question, and they were asking, how would you recommend dealing with part of the organization that they say their work is so critical, they don't want to patch or fix anything because that may interrupt it. And one of the ways to get around that is to demonstrate impact, right? So, say you're dealing with cross-site scripting, you're just throwing up an alert box and delivering the report. But there's also, say, cookie without HTTP only flag. Okay, you could have combined those vulnerabilities to use that to send a session cookie off to a malicious server to show the client, hey, not only is there a cross-site scripting vulnerability here, but this in combination with the other one can be abused to steal session cookies as shown in this screenshot and compromise user sessions. So when you're dealing with something like that, demonstrating impact is key. So, I definitely want to hit on that point. So if you're dealing with something in your organization where, someone doesn't want to fix something, sometimes the best way to, get them to do that would be to demonstrate that impact and what that might be. We had one situation where we gained system level access to an access control system that would allow us physical access to the building to create badges and the like and gain physical access. And so we described that in the report just so the company understood the impact of gaining access to a machine like that. So impact is key, and demonstrating that well should be the goal of a pen test.
And Chris, do you think there's a consideration when you say that you have an environment that has all updated servers and workstations, but then you have one server that's running outdated code, outdated operating system? Do you think that's a concern for an organization?
Yeah, that should be a concern because, one of the things we do during a pen test is if there is a highly vulnerable system, and you have maybe all your other systems are up to date, but if we can gain, system access to that vulnerable system and then dump stored hashes and use those hashes to gain access to other systems on the network, you created one weak point that allowed, a malicious attacker to turn it into many weak points.
Yeah, and we have a lot of examples of pen tests like that. We've had one where we perform the internal pen test, we gain, full system domain administrator, enterprise administrator access. And I remember the next morning speaking to the IT manager, and she was telling me that I saw your access, I saw you creating the accounts, I saw you performing these actions on my domain controllers and on other servers, but I couldn't do anything about it. I couldn't disable your account, I couldn't delete your account, I had no power. My AV wasn't catching it. And that pen test actually, it started from one weak system on their very, very secure IT infrastructure. And it was definitely very eye-opening for her. And she realized that, okay, we really need to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps.
So this next area is vulnerability scans versus pen testing. What do these terms mean, and what's the difference? And so, Chris, can you tell us a little bit about this, explain the differences and what each is?
Sure. You can think of a vulnerability scan as a minimal dive, right? Vulnerability scans often will give you false positives that need to be filtered out. They will discover maybe a CVE if they can enumerate a version of something. But this is an automated process, and say, for example, it fails to enumerate a version, an experienced pen tester can go in there and throw the most recent or most common exploits at that system without the version information and potentially identify and exploit that system accordingly. So, vulnerability scanning can be a helpful tool, but it is an automated process and it's limited to the things it can discover and cross-reference. This is different than a human pen tester that would bring in, background experience, human intuition, and curiosity into the equation. And one of the ways, this curiosity becomes key in penetration testing is during information gathering stages. Typically a vulnerability scanner might run, one TCP scan using the most common ports, right? The problem with that is if you're just scanning for the most common ports, you're not scanning all the ports, and you very well may miss critical vulnerabilities that wouldn't otherwise be discovered. And, furthermore, on top of that, when you're dealing with, say, for example, Nmap scans, and you're only running one type of scan methodology, you're going to yield the results from that specific scan, but another type of scan methodology may yield you different results. So, during the information gathering stage, your penetration tester should be relying on several different scanning methodologies to deliver the most comprehensive results in terms of port enumeration and service enumeration. And during this stage, we also obviously enumerate services and components of web applications. Deep dive research is done into any versions that may be enumerated or any components or technologies. We utilize multiple sources to cross-reference that to search for known vulnerabilities. And even in, the information gathering stages, sometimes we use social media research, right? There's been occasions where you can utilize social media research so that later on, when you have to do maybe a limited, slow brute force attack that won't cause denial of service, you can now, you have the employee names you can add to that user list, and you're more likely to gain access to a system that way. So, information gathering is key, and if it's not done right, like most of these vulnerability scanners will do themselves, they'll just do the most common ports, things will get missed, and your environment, even though, you may have paid quite a bit of money for your pen test, your environment will still be vulnerable. And, the pen tester may miss it entirely. And, this also goes into filtering false positives, right? It's an important part of the process, right? Because if you get a report back that says, you've got eternal blue on one of your main servers and your IT guys go rush and unplug the server until they can remediate it, now you've interrupted business operations and it turns out it was a false positive the whole time. And one of the ways, we look to deal with these false positives is we do manual validation, meaning, we go in and we actually try to exploit the system and verify that vulnerability is there. If we, for some reason can't obtain access to a system, we use other tools to enumerate version information to see if we're getting the same responses as the original tool returned. And so, a good cybersecurity engineer, if things like version information can't be enumerated using common methodologies, one of the things we'll do is look for recent and common vulnerabilities, right? We had one incident where we were dealing with a firewall. The vulnerability scanner couldn't enumerate the version information, but I did have some concerns about the SSL VPN service, so I went and did source code analysis of their login page and, identified that, hey, this firewall was vulnerable to the magic backdoor, which would essentially allow me to reset the password of any VPN user and lock them out and use their access to, gain access to internal resources. And that was only discovered because we looked for recent and common vulnerabilities. It wasn't something that a vulnerability scan picked up. It was the human behind the keyboard that did it. And another important thing is to combine results from, all your scanning tools. Because as I mentioned, as we talked about before, when you're dealing with a single tool and you're not combining results, you may miss things. And this goes back to, checking all the ports. If you're not doing that, you're going to miss things. And if you miss things, now you've got a vulnerability you're not even aware of, which is a problem. And obviously it's important to analyze and manually validate the findings. That might be done through exploitation, or if that's, not a path you might take in a particular context, such as something with like a denial of service vulnerability where you wouldn't test that, then you might enumerate version information carefully to identify that the vulnerability exists. And so when you're dealing with penetration tests, one of the things a computer doesn't really do well that humans do is chain vulnerabilities, right? This goes back to that simple cross-site scripting example where I'm sure many of you have seen reports that show that alert box, and there might even be another section on there that says, hey, there was a cookie without an HTTP only flag, and it's the session cookie. And the engineer didn't combine those to demonstrate impact for you. And those two combined they create a higher risk when they're combined as opposed to separately, right? Because the one leads to, accessing and obtaining a user account session, and it demonstrates that impact, whereas the other is just limited to an alert box, and it doesn't really help the client understand what can actually be done with it. And we also go in and not only do we research enumerated versions using the common vulnerabilities and exposures, publications that are out there, but we do, search for any zero-day exploits or public zero-day exploits that may or may not be recognized as a CVE at the time. Identifying those is critical too, because again, if you're just relying on the CVE and you don't identify the public 0-day that hasn't been recognized as a CVE, then now you've got a vulnerability you missed, you didn't exploit, and the client can't fix it. And this goes down to too, a good pen tester, they'll evaluate the responses, their efforts, and attempt to expand the exploitation attempt. So again, back to that cross-site scripting example, did they just throw out the alert box, or did they use it to steal a session cookie and compromise a user account? Which can be done, legally, provided you have credentialed access to the account, and permission to do so. You can illustrate that using the account credentials you were given. But that goes back to being able to expand the exploitation attempts and demonstrate that impact. Right, so choosing the right type of pen test is critical. We talked a lot about how it's important to communicate with the pen tester, get an idea of the tools they use and what they do. And Bogdan and Eric, they're going to go more into the difference between black, gray, white box testing and static versus dynamic.
Yeah, so with with the types of pen tests, a black box pen test is really you're just giving the vendor the name of your organization, and that's about it. A gray box is maybe you're provided with a little bit more information, maybe the name and a few email addresses or a few IP addresses. You're given just bits and pieces of information. And in the white box, you're essentially given all the information that you need to be dangerous. And then as a pen tester, they can take that information and extrapolate on it and then build a custom attack plan. And then underneath that, you have your static versus dynamic. So a static test is essentially inside out. So if you're taking a external pen test, for example, a static of an external would be closer to something like a firewall configuration audit, where they would review the firewall, review your configurations, and then provide you with insight as to, hey, these are where you can make adjustments based on industry best practices, based on NIST, or based on whatever frameworks you are required to follow, and you can make changes to your infrastructure, whether it's IT or physical, based on that information. And then a dynamic pen test is from the outside in, where the pen tester engages your external environment or web application or your internal network from an outside perspective. So like, for example, with internal, a static test of your internal network would be like the vendor performing a configuration audit of your domain controllers, of your SQL servers, of your internal firewalls, your internal managed switches and routers, and provide you with insight as to where configuration options need to be updated. That way you're more secure, you're more prepared for a response or an investigation. And then a dynamic of an internal pen test would be where the vendor is provided with maybe a VPN access, or they put a black box device on your internal network, and that black box device acts like a conduit, and it's supposed to simulate what happens when there was maybe a malware intrusion on your internal network, which then gives the attacker a means of sending commands and performing vulnerability scans on an internal network, and then they target the domain controller and all that type of stuff, whatever's in scope. So, there's a lot of different in ways of organizing these, but most of these can be kind of put under the hat of black, gray, and white box, static versus dynamic, and then you have just your general list of all the types of pen tests you can do. That way you can get a better idea as to the state of your security within your organization and within your IT network, and even within your actual physical buildings and offices. So a few key takeaways as we wrap up here. We kind of want to give you just an outline of penetration testing versus vulnerability scanning. Eric, did you want to jump in here and maybe provide some insight?
Sure. So it'll kind of review the pen test is going to cost more than a vulnerability scan, but it's going to provide a lot more information for you. The time involved is also going to be higher since it takes longer to do the pen test because pen test is involving not only the vulnerability scanning, but everything else, the validation and the manual efforts. So there is automated scanning on both the penetration test and the vulnerability scan. Both of them are going to discover public vulnerabilities and identify vulnerabilities individually. And you're going to be able to rank the risk level on both because it's going to pull from these public databases with risk gradients for each of the vulnerabilities in their CV. Version enumeration, the vulnerability scan will do that sometimes. It depends. That'll definitely be done in a penetration test. You'll be able to identify then all the rest of these in a penetration test, but not a vulnerability scan. The vulnerability chaining, filtering out false positives, manual validation, of course, is something that's done in penetration testing. And this is a very important part. And then giving more of the analysis, the description, and this information useful for determining the remediation compriorities and such, and then having that human element of doing the exploitation rather than just being automated computerized scan. So understanding those two key terms is probably the biggest takeaway, because you're going to need to plan appropriately and be able to communicate with the vendors to say, this is what I expect out of a penetration test, and ensure that you are getting what you're paying for. So we're going to go through some questions here in a sec. Do want to point out penetration testing is a big part of what we do. We are a cybersecurity company doing everything from cybersecurity assessments and policy work and managed services. But pen testing is a major service we offer. We are happy to answer different questions you have here, and then you can also reach out to us. Our email addresses are provided, and we'd be happy to talk with you more about whatever pen testing questions you have or assist you on your next pen test. So let's take a look at what questions do we have. First one, let's see, you answered this one already.
The question just came in, Eric. It says, do penetration tests stop when a foothold is made into the customer's network? How can I ensure I'm getting a complete pen test to identify multiple findings?
Yeah, that's
go ahead, Eric. Okay,
go ahead.
And Chris, you can jump in here too if you want. A pen test should not stop as soon as one foothold is made. Typically in a scenario like that, what we've learned from experience, and Chris, you can maybe talk to this, is that if there's a pen test and you can gain one foothold, the probability of you being able to gain another foothold using a different method is fairly high. So when you're considering your vendors, you definitely want to be able to ask those probing questions. I think it's okay to ask, and have them define, when does a pen test stop for you? Is it upon initial compromise, or do you guys look at all variables? Chris, do you have any input there?
A pen test really shouldn't stop when a foothold is gained. It should definitely be expanded, right? So if you're dealing with an external test where someone was able to get access to internal resources, now they have a different view of more and more systems, and that goes back to extreme impact. So getting the foothold, seeing what you can do with that foothold, is step two, and it's only by doing step two that the client gets more quality for their money and a better understanding of the impact of that vulnerability. As I mentioned before, one weak machine on an internal network can turn into the compromise of many, and as Bogdan touched on as well. So, if you do a penetration test document and it does show that the person able to establish a foothold, it should also show, either A, we are able to use that foothold to leverage and get access to more, or B, we weren't able to use the foothold to get access more, and here's why.
Yeah, I think it's important here, to recognize that there are multiple layers to your security system, and you want your penetration test to be able to address that. There may be multiple different entry points to a system, and if the penetration tester stops at the first and easiest one and says, "Okay, I'm done, I got in," that you're going to remediate that one and then find out, oh, there are two more. That's totally missing the goal of the test. You want to be able to identify each of those so that when the organization does remediate those, now they're in a secure place rather than just being a step closer. The idea isn't to generate a ton of different pen tests. We want to be able to do this in that engagement. So it looks like, let's see, I don't see any other questions here. Want to thank you all for your time. Also let you know that just by attending this webinar, you do have opportunity to win an Amazon gift card. So pay attention for more details. But thank you all for your time. It was a pleasure talking with you about this important topic. Thank you, Bogdan. Thank you, Chris, for great insights.